So my name is Sydney Brilliard Coyle. I use the pronouns they, them, near, which I will explain in a little bit. I'm currently 23 years old, about to turn 24, and I'm living in southwestern Ontario. I am a Master's of Arts student at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I also have a Bachelor of Music and a Bachelor of Arts in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Windsor. Definitely I've been doing a lot of work within the field of, queer theory and queer studies and stuff for the last number of years, and looking forward to continuing to pursue that. So I guess just a bit about my story. So when I was a kid, I was always raised with the belief that it didn't matter who I loved as long as they made me happy. So I was very fortunate to live in a very accepting household. My parents didn't necessarily use the terminology of queer, and back then being trans wasn't really talked about or known, I guess. So I didn't really come to know about what it means to be trans until I was in high school. But I always pretty much knew that I was queer, I would say. I was always interested in mainly girls. I remember growing up with Webkinz, stuffed animals, and I've always been a very imaginative person, and I would create all kinds of stories with the Webkinz, and a lot of my Webkinz were lesbians, because that's just kind of was very much normalized for me, I guess, and it was just a part of my childhood. So I was very fortunate in that sense. And then when I was around 11 years old, my parents and I moved to the county for my mom's work, and that was a very different experience from living in the city, because in the county it was not at all diverse, and they had very problematic attitudes. So during that time, I came out without realizing that I was coming out, because it had been so normalized. So I was like, oh yeah, I like girls, just kind of casually. And then that proceeded, so I had come out to one person, and then she basically proceeded to out me to the rest of the school. And I dealt with a lot of homophobic bullying for the next couple of years. And that was the first time that I kind of learned about the prejudice that those of us in the queer community can experience. So after that, I went back into, I guess, the closet. I just out of concern for my own safety. And then I transferred schools for my grade 8 year. We moved back into the city, and then that move enabled me to go to an amazing high school, Walkerville Collegiate Institute, which is in Windsor. Windsor is where I grew up. And Walkerville is known locally as the gay school. Partially because it's an arts school, so there's a bit of that stereotype. But also just because it's a very accepting environment. Many of my friends would transfer from other schools just so that they could come out, so that they could transition, so they could have that freedom to explore who they were. So I was very lucky to go to Walkerville, because it definitely gave me the courage, I would say, to explore again, something that I really kind of tried to push down after what happened in elementary school after I was outed. So when I went to Walkerville and I was surrounded by so many people who were, on their own journeys of coming out and exploring different pronouns, I was like, okay, this is a safe environment where I can do that. And being around so many others in the community really gave me the language to describe the things that I didn't know existed, I guess. Growing up, I was always, I guess, what you'd consider a tomboy. I would shop in the boys section because I hate the color pink still to today. I'm not a fan of pink at all, but I was just very, I would say, more masculine kind of growing up. So then when I found out that, trans was a thing, when one of my close friends came out as trans, and then he started his journey of transitioning, I was like, there's this whole world of possibilities in terms of gender that I didn't really know existed. So then I spent a lot of time, exploring things, doing a lot of Googling where I'm I feel this way, what could this mean, looking at different terms, seeing what resonated, what didn't. For a little while, I considered myself as more gender fluid because I found this relationship was particularly prevalent in terms of pronouns, where some days people would use, like she pronouns for me and that felt okay, or people would use he pronouns for me and that felt okay, or they pronouns. And I felt like that fluctuated on different days. So that's why I was like, okay, maybe I'm gender fluid. And, I kind of alternated with pronouns based on what felt best for that particular day. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I was like, it's still not really resonating with me, and I don't like she or he. Doesn't feel like it captures who I am. So then I just stuck with they, them pronouns for a little while. And then, graduated high school and everything. And then when I turned 20, I was like, okay, they, them has been all right, but I wonder if there's something that would be even better, that would be more like, yes, this is who I am kind of thing. And that's when I discovered they, them pronouns. So they, them is a neo-pronoun. So neo-pronouns are basically any type of gender-neutral pronoun that was created from anywhere from the 1800s to today. And they, them, so just a little bit of the history of my pronouns is they, them was created actually all the way back in 1850. And it appeared out of a debate about where people were saying, using he/she in sentences is clumsy, so they wanted an alternative. So somebody, no idea who, but somebody created they, them, and the N stands for neutral. And for me, as a 20-year-old, when I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's it, because I feel neutral, my sense of intensity about how neutral I feel changes, but it's always neutral, like neutral is my baseline. So then to see that represented in a pronoun was like, yeah, I think that's good. So then I did my looking more into the history, and I practiced with my own pronouns because I'm like, okay, these are unfamiliar. I need to learn how to use my own pronouns, right? And told my parents, told a couple of friends, and then later I came out again because coming out is just that continual journey. Came out again on social media on the Trans Day of Visibility because I like having things with certain awareness days. It's kind of fun. So the challenge, I would say, with when I started to use they, them pronouns was it was right when the pandemic was hitting. And, when you're having one-on-one conversations, generally you don't use pronouns, right? Unless you're talking about other people. So I was like, okay, I have these new pronouns, but I've not really been in a context where people would need to use pronouns for me. So are these the right fit? I didn't really have a chance to, test them out. Until I started working at a trans organization, and I was hearing my coworkers use they, them pronouns in reference to me, and it was like, yeah, that's it, that fits. And I would say one of the other kind of defining moments that really confirmed my pronouns for me was in my exploration of different pronouns, and I looked at many different pronouns, but there was this really cool website where you can choose a pronoun, and then you choose a short story, and then the website puts the pronoun into the short story and stuff. So I chose they, them pronouns, and then I chose the story Alice in Wonderland because I didn't recognize any of the other stories, and I was like, oh, sure, why not? Kind of familiar with that one. So then I got to read the first, maybe a couple of pages of Alice in Wonderland with they, them pronouns being used, and I was like, oh, this is really neat. I just really like how this looks and how this feels for me. So whenever I'm describing kind of how things feel for me, because I do a lot of, pronoun trainings and education programs and such, I always look for more of the visual element because I'm very much a visual learner. So when people use she, her pronouns for me, it feels like I'm being dropped into a pit of hot lava. So it's not a great experience. It just feels inherently wrong. It's like, that's not who I am. I've found when people use he, him pronouns for me, it would be like kind of laying on a bed of nails. So it's not lava, so that's progress, but it's still not really comfortable. When people use they, them pronouns for me, it's like, okay, I'm laying on the floor, when I'm really tired from studying, I can lay on the floor and, be semi-comfortable and maybe even take a nap, but it's still not there for me. Whereas when people use my actual pronouns, they, them, It's like laying on my bed with my comfy blanket and my cat purring on top of me. It's just the most warm and comfortable and just like validating experience. And that's really grown over the last couple of years, I would say. It's just my understanding of pronouns and what they mean to me and what they mean to other people. That was a lot of the inspiration behind my recent book that I published, which is A Pocket Guide to Pronouns. And basically this book just talks about different pronouns, pronoun etiquette, steps towards allyship and inclusiveness. And basically it just like goes through the different pronouns that people can use. And then I have the little short stories, because just thinking back to that Alice in Wonderland and how meaningful that was, I was like, I want to be able to give that to other people. So I created these short little stories on all kinds of topics, pianist debut concert, somebody likes dodgeball but not basketball, or gymnastics or something like that, just all kinds of little fun topics, and created these little characters that were designed by a good friend of mine, Owen. And just really incorporating the different pronouns so people could see how these pronouns were used, and more importantly to just really kind of humanize that experience, where it's like, trans people, we are who we are, and our stories deserve to be told, which is why things like the Trans Canada Project are just so important. And that's a bit of what I wanted to capture in A Pocket Guide to Pronouns. And also because I just get so many questions about pronouns that, I was joking with a friend a couple years ago, I'm like, oh, somebody should just write a pocket guide to pronouns. So here we are. So I wrote my book. I also do a lot of training programs about, the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. I founded a company called Rainbow Allyship, and we provide allyship training. We also do audits of things like paperwork. And then personally, I also do different keynotes, again, just helping people understand more about the queer and trans community and our experiences. So I've been doing presentations for a number of years. I actually used to be involved with the We charity, so I went to We Days across Canada from 2012 to 2013. I was 12 and 13 at the time. And yeah, I mean, speaking in front of 20,000 people was an experience, but it was really meaningful to be able to share that space with so many people who were just like-minded and who wanted to make change. And each of us had different passions and different causes that we cared about, but we shared that goal where it's like, there's things that aren't working and we have the power to make that change. And I think that's a lot of what's inspired the kind of work that I have done and continue to do, especially within the queer and trans community. As somebody who is within the queer and trans community, I've experienced, personally firsthand, the many challenges that so many of us do, where, those things like bullying, where you experience, the people who just don't understand who you are, who are homophobic and transphobic, and the impact that can have on people. I've seen firsthand in terms of things like the mental health impacts. Being surrounded by so many people in the queer community throughout my high school career was amazing, but I also saw how, those previous experiences of rejection and, being rejected from family and friends and from school environments, the impact that can have on people. And then the kind of work that I've done over the last couple of years in providing that direct support, as a peer mentor. And I worked up at a summer camp as like a mental health medic. Like, I see the impact that this has on people, and I've had my own experiences of mental health challenges and stuff, and that's why this kind of like social justice work is so important, and that's what really, I would say, fuels me in the moments when it feels like really tough to continue. It's like just the reminder that this is literally life-saving work, and it's so necessary. And especially for queer and trans youth to be able to see themselves represented, to know that they're not alone. And I never like the cliche of like, it gets better, but that you can find a community of people who do celebrate you and who support you and accept you. And that is so vital. I'm just remembering like last year, 2 years ago, I planned this event for GSA students, Gender Sexuality Alliance students. And it was just like a one-day event. We invited students from across the region to come and participate, and they heard guest speakers, and we had a couple of workshops and, performances and stuff. It was really just a celebration day. And it was really important for us as the event organizers to focus on that celebration piece, because so often the narrative that surrounds our community is one of deep trauma and deep pain. And while it's important to shed light on that and to talk about that, it's also important to talk about joy and the meaningful things that can come from being part of this community and connecting with the community. And I saw how important that was for the youth who hadn't really had the chance to connect with like queer adults. I myself have been treated like a non-binary elder, which is weird for me as a 23-year-old. But I get it, because I don't know many like non-binary adults who are much older than me. I think one of the oldest non-binary people I've met is, maybe in their 50s or something. So I get it. It's hard to find those role models and those mentors. And in particular, I just remember there was this one youth, probably 14 or 15, that at the end of this GSA celebration day came up to me and was like, "I've never met anybody else who uses they/them pronouns." And it was just such an incredible moment for both of us, because that was also my first time meeting somebody else who used they/them pronouns. And just for that youth to be able to see me in all of my visibility and, my pride, and to know that, like, yes, queer people can grow up and be adults and be able to be connected to community and can do amazing things. It's just so important. So I was really glad to be able to share that moment with that youth, for both of us. So in terms of my own future, I'm very much a planner. So I like having plans. So it's hard for me to not have a specific plan for my future and to kind of keep things open, but I'm also leaving room for whatever may kind of transpire, because I know that what I'm doing currently right now, if you had told me a few years ago that I would be doing this, I probably would not have believed you. To have published a book and to be in a different city studying a master's, and I also ran for city council in 2022. Like, there's so much over the last couple of years in particular that are not what I pictured for myself. So I guess that's kind of challenged me to be more flexible and to not plan everything out, and to be like, okay, let's see what happens and what kind of inspires me, and kind of go with that. So I can definitely, no matter what my future looks like, I know it's going to be doing advocacy and social justice work within the queer and trans community. That is fundamental to who I am, and what I want to do. In terms of how that takes place, I'm definitely keeping my options open in terms of what that looks like. I have recently applied for a PhD program in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. So I'm definitely considering, furthering my education, and specifically research around the queer and trans community. So here as a master's student, I am about to enter a major research project where I'm going to specifically look at queer representation in young adult literature. And I'm really looking forward to being able to do this. Again, just emphasizing how important that representation is for queer and trans folks, and how so often it's not present. I remember growing up, I always loved books, but so many of them just didn't have queer people, let alone trans people. It just wasn't there, or it would be such a minor character and such a minor thing, or it would be revealed after the series was published, where it's like, oh, surprise, this character is actually, queer, even though there was no indicators and it was never said explicitly, right? But to have intentional representation and diverse representation is so vital. Unfortunately, it's just not become mainstream. And that's, I guess, where I want to kind of focus my research, is in the importance of having that representation, and why it's so vital, both for queer and trans folks to see ourselves represented, but also for cis het folks to be able to understand us better, to understand our stories, is really vital. I would say the one book that particularly comes to mind for me is called Rainbow Islands. It's one of my favorite books, and it was really my first real exposure to having such positive like queer and trans representation in a novel. And the main character is a trans man, and it's just like so incredibly diverse. There's so many identities represented. There's asexual people represented, and like I'm asexual myself, and I've never seen that in a novel before, and that was just so affirming for me to be able to see that. And I want to see more of that. And I can definitely see myself writing some of my own books with queer characters, more of the fiction. Of course, I have my pocket guide to pronouns, but more of the fiction fantasy. And I do have some ideas in the works right now. But I would say that that's just really important, and I can see my future kind of continuing to develop that, both in research and in my own writing. And then just generally within the social justice work. Right now, we're at the beginning of 2024 when this was kind of filmed, and we're facing a lot of backlash right now. There's a lot of anti-trans and anti-queer sentiments. In September 2023, we saw like one of the biggest anti-trans, anti-queer marches in a very long time, with the 1 Million March for Children, as they claim. Of course, there's the counter movement, 1 Million Voices for Inclusion, and I myself was part of the counter protests in both September and October. But this is the reality that we're living in, is that we are seeing this backlash, and unfortunately, I do believe it's going to get worse before it gets better, is we're going to continue to see this, and that's why it is so important for people to stand up, to stand in solidarity with the community. And that's where I think a lot of my future work is going to lie, is continuing to educate. I get questions all the time from folks about terminology or about pronouns or how they can be allies and stuff. And personally, I'm okay with being an educator. Most of the time, there's some days where I'm like, I don't want to educate, just Google it. So when you are asking those questions, it's important to be mindful of people's boundaries and everything, and to try to use other resources before you're expecting your queer and trans friends to educate. People get paid to do things like write books about pronouns, right? So it's important to be mindful of that. But I can definitely see myself continuing to engage in that education work, because I really do believe that education is the key to combating misinformation. When I do my training programs, people are like, oh, I had no idea about the diversity of gender and how many genders there are and how people can experience gender, or, sexuality and like asexuality, for example. There's not much talked about in relation to that, but that's continuing to develop. Or, the things about like how to be an ally and how to not be an ally, like problematic things that actually cause more harm. And that's where education is so vital. So I definitely see myself continuing to do that work for the next number of years, as long as it's needed, I would say, which will probably be for a while. But, it's important for all of us, as we have the capacity to continue to engage in that work. And most importantly, for allies to be willing to have these types of conversations, to listen to our stories, to understand better, and then to take action. So I would say if there's one thing that I could tell people, it's just have an openness and a willingness to learn. Even those of us in the trans and queer community, we have a lot to learn. I'm still learning every day. When I was in the process of writing my pocket guide to pronouns, I was learning a lot about the different pronouns that people use, and there were some moments that challenged me. And I think that when we're challenged, there's often an automatic kind of defensiveness that comes up where people are like, oh, I don't understand that, I'm not comfortable with that, I don't want to talk about it, because we don't want to have the uncomfortable conversations. But the uncomfortable conversations are necessary. Whenever I've engaged in social justice work, I remember I was at this leadership conference a number of years ago, and they drew this kind of like diagram. So in the center of this diagram, we can see the comfort zone. And that's the things that we're most comfortable with, I'm happy to talk about, this particular book. I love talking about this book. I really know a lot of things about this book, for example. And then, so that's the very center of it is the comfort zone. And then we have the growth zone, and then we have the panic zone. I'm gonna come back to the growth zone. But the panic zone is the things that it's like, I am not at all comfortable talking about this. You know, you get into that state of like, basically panic, where it's like, this is not at all what I'm okay with talking about. And then we have the in-between, which is the growth zone. And it's not entirely comfortable, but it's not entirely panic. And that's where the growth happens. And that's where a lot of our conversations have to focus, is in that growth zone, because that's where we can really start to engage in these deeper issues that affect trans and queer folks, and just really actually make change, because we can't make change when we're comfortable, and we can't make change when we're panicked. But when we're in that nice in-between zone, where we can grow, where we can be challenged and say, okay, I'm not entirely comfortable with this, but I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to have the conversation, that is where that change happens. So I would encourage people to continue to engage in those conversations, even when, and especially when, we're not entirely comfortable, when we are challenged, because I know that I am, and that is where I have grown and learned the most. So as we continue to really just engage in these conversations, I encourage each of you, if there's one thing that you take away from this, is to challenge yourselves, is to really intentionally listen and learn, and to push down that automatic defensiveness, because when we open ourselves up to share our stories and to hear other people's stories, that's where we can actually make true change.